the fun thing about Tibetan history is that all that most people know about it is sort of the social media version of it, right? So, probably everybody's at least heard of the Dalai Lama, and a lot of people, have some idea of what the Dalai Lama is. But as far as the regular people in Tibet, that's much more of a mystery. Even among the people who are really interested, I think the Tibetan culture is sort of just an extrapolation of The Lost Horizon, the famous novel that was written in 1933, where everybody's sort of floating on clouds and there's this kind of magical thing. So especially for the people who are interested in the language and interested in the the religious texts and how those developed and how they can apply them to their own life, it's kind of there's a really great value in understanding the people that were actually behind that. It wasn't just sort of words handed down from the cosmos somewhere. These were actual people living in actual times with real sort of problems, just like the rest of us. So that makes it really interesting. And from the modern perspective, there's of course, the politics of Tibet is maybe more complex or extreme than many others over the last 100 years or so. And so, putting a face to those problems that those people have now, I think has, a ton of value, and sort of understanding that it's not just as simple as, China invaded Tibet, right? Nothing is ever quite that simple. So to have a sort of nuanced view of it, if that's something that is really interesting to people, I think is really important, but it's really hard to find that. So what makes Nepal especially interesting to me is that it's sort of like Tibet in a way, like this lost little kingdom sort of stuck in the middle of the Himalayas somewhere. It's between India and China, which takes up all of the news cycle and all of the attention. I've been working in Nepal for 16 years, and even some of my family members still think it's a state, like in India, right? so, for the same reasons, to give agency to the people. But the other thing that's really fascinating about it is that, contrary to maybe some people who are a little bit more aware of the history, Nepal was never the same sort of colonial state of like Great Britain or the UK, for example, as India was, or parts of India. Nepal never really was under even the Mughal Empire. There was always sort of this level of independence, partly by geographic isolation, because they were sort of just tucked away in this, because there's a mountain range actually to the north and the south of Nepal. And then you have the Terai, which it's not exactly desert, but in terms of travel, especially 200-300 years ago, it was a barrier. So there was this isolation that they had that preserved them. And so it kind of developed and flourished its own culture, which we don't hear much about. And then again, kind of the same thing in the modern times is that, Nepal became a bastion for Tibetan refugees who left China. But that situation was always complex, and I think in many ways in the last 20 or so years has grown even more complicated, because China has spent a lot of money in Nepal, and by virtue of doing that, they have some control over the politics. And Tibet has always been a soft spot for some places and a very sore spot for others. And so that has kind of put the Nepali government sort of in the middle. So, even for someone who's maybe not necessarily super interested in the Nepali context, but they are interested in the Tibetan context, there's a very, very significant interweaving and overlap. And it's both fascinating, sad, and also has some really good parts of it too. When I first went to grad school, my original sort of broad topic was to study Chinese history. And that quickly sort of morphed into Tibetan history, and then also the history of what we'll call generally Central Asia. To study Tibetan history, I needed to have some handle of the language, at least be able to read, to examine historical texts. But of course, studying Tibetan in China was not impossible, but not exactly easy or amenable. And I learned some of that the hard way, which will be a story for maybe in class sometime. But so the next obvious choice though was either Nepal or India, and Nepal actually just by luck, uh, the headmaster of a school there that was teaching Tibetan to foreigners, who actually was himself educated in Harvard, had taught one of my own professors. I ran into him sort of by chance, just Google searching or whatever. But when I found the place and I ran it by that professor, it just kind of was like this fortuitous sort of, meeting of the minds. And so that was in near Kathmandu in Nepal. So that's how I ended up in Nepal in the first place. Was ironically to study Tibetan, and then life happened over the next several decades that just kept me there and doing a whole bunch of other things. So yeah, so I mean, Tibet and Tibetan studies was actually the reason I ended up in Nepal, and then they kind of just stuck together. So I have two sort of very different courses. So so far at least. So for the history class, um, it kind of can, I think, be attractive to a broad audience. So like I said, I mean, the obvious audience would be people who are interested in Tibetan language, Tibetan texts, Tibetan culture. Where did those things come from? How did they evolve over time? Um, you know, a lot of the students that study those things know the big names. Your Tsongkhapas, your Chandrakiris, people like that, but not so much the people that made those people become who they were. Right. So that's where I like to focus. The second thing is because as Craig and I worked on the law codes, we got pretty heavily into the sort of secular part of the domestic politics. How do we actually govern things? That there's always a religious element, but how do we govern the things that like we just have to do as a sort of matter of course? Like how do we deal with taxes? How do we deal with who owns what property, or whose cow belongs to who? Those sorts of things. Um, and so I think that just adds interesting an interesting context to Tibet wherever someone's interest comes from. So if they have some interest in Tibet, it adds that context. But the second part of the history class is also the international part of it. So for someone who's maybe interested in the historical political science, how did great powers, manipulate different places, and how did they engage in colonialism, and how did they, foster their economic interests? Those stories are always told by those powers. And so sometimes it's lost on what was going on in Tibet and what was going on in Nepal. So for the people who are really interested in sort of just not necessarily Tibet specific, but just how did those types of things develop in places we don't hear much about, that's another part of it. And then the third part is also just the sort of the intrigue angle. So one thing that is lost by people who don't study Tibetan history closely, or even the history of Central Asia, some of the most fascinating historical plots occurred in those areas. So one of the areas I touch on in this course is the Zongar of them, from they were a Mongol sub empire within the larger Mongol context. And their story is fascinating because they played an instrumental part in the power ascension to power of the Dalai Lamas. And they also found themselves on the end of a genocide where one of the most powerful and longest serving Chinese emperors literally tried to, remove them from history. And probably most people that really haven't looked at this area of the world probably don't even really know that, because for one, he was partially successful. So I think just people who are just interested in sort of the weird stories of history and the intrigue and the politics that's just never talked about, it also has that attractiveness to them. For the other course, which I'm talking more about the environmental and climate change situation, and that this one obviously could also appeal from a historical standpoint because I do cover sort of how it's changed over time. But I think, as Craig said in my description, I'm more of a field guy at heart, person that likes to be out there in the mud doing the things. And so I have a lot of experience with that. I've spent a lot of the last year in some of the remotest parts of the Himalayas, on the Nepal side. And, I got to see sort of firsthand what people are doing and how it's sort of affecting them. I've even been in the middle of disasters that were ongoing. Um, and so I think bringing a personalized rendition of those types of stories would be really helpful for people who are concerned about climate change, who are concerned about, drying up of glaciers and freshwater sources. The Himalayas are one of the largest freshwater sources of the world. Somewhere around 1 billion people rely on it, and just in the last few years, more than 200 gigatons of ice have melted and not been restored over the normal cycle. So I get into a lot of those without being I don't want to be overly sciencey, because some people aren't science oriented or educated, but they're interested. So the idea is to sort of bring attention to and bring some learning about those subjects for people who are not necessarily the ones who quite understand the mechanics of it, but certainly the implications. The way I see it is, we have a lot of ways we can spend our time. Um, and I'm not any person more qualified than another to judge how we do that. But one thing that we can say, if we're judging a little bit, is that the variety and the fruitfulness of opportunities for how we spend that time, I think, is far more interesting than it's ever been at any point before. Because, for example, we're having this conversation right now, and you're at least 5,000 or 6,000 miles from where I'm sitting, right? Um, so, when it comes to figuring out how do I want to spend my day, or how do I want to flex my brain a little bit, or just how do I want to seek out and see if something new is compelling to me, that I want to take it to a different level. This is one really cool way to do that. I mean, you can spend money on, I have friends that spend tons of money on, like, rebuilding motorcycles, and other friends who spend a lot of money, going out and fishing, buying all kinds of equipment and stuff. And all those things are great. Um, but this is just this is another outlook, or another output of sorts, that someone can do that. But this one has the benefit of doing it from your own room. And I think, given all of the different topics that we teach, between Craig, myself, you, and everybody else, between all the different topics that we teach, there's so many areas that are just so fascinating that, just dabbling even in a course or two might really open up a whole new literal section of the world, and a mental section of the world, in the sense of what someone might want to study or pursue.